And welcome. Good morning, and welcome to our latest Full Steam Ahead webinar. Thank you for joining us. If we've not met, I'm Carrie Fellers, the Director of Membership here at Geothermal Rising, and I'm delighted to be your moderator today. We have some amazing speakers from the utility perspective today, but before we introduce them, I have a few announcements. I want to let you know that we are recording this event and it will be available on our YouTube channel in the next few days. We want to thank our members for their continued support. And, oh, hold on. Excellent. And kind of walk through a couple of those. So a huge thank you to our Earth Energy Visionary members, Turbidin, SLB, Quays, Exceed, Ever, EggGeo, Calpine, and Baker Hughes. And then our geothermal champions, Burns and McDonnell, COSO, BHE Renewables, Chevron, Expro, and Fervo. And then also Halliburton, Curita, Neighbors, NOV, Ormat, Oxy, Sinclair, and Southern Company. And then our thank you to our Clean Energy Sustainer members, which are Zanskar, XGS, Steamflow, Valoric New Energies, NREL, Geologica, Imperial County in California, DTEC, Distributed Energy Group, Bantam, Central Washington University, Baseload Capital, and Amoresco. So we can't do this without our members. Thank you so much. And if you are a member or if you're interested in membership, it's time to renew and sign up for 2026. We do have some special opportunities for our organizational memberships. For all organizations signing up, we have 2025 pricing for 2026. And then we have some other special incentives for our top tier folks. And then we do not have that special for the individuals because we're not raising prices on individuals this year. So we invite you all to sign up. That's how we make all of these kinds of wonderful activities happen. And we'd be delighted for you to join us. So just a last thing, here's some of our upcoming events. We have our Thermal Energy Network Symposium in March in Baltimore. Our Geothermal Investment Forum will be in Houston in April, and its partner event is the Technical Symposium on Mutual Challenges and Solutions. Will also be at the same time in Houston. Our Capitol Hill Day will be next April. Our next Indigenous Geothermal Symposium will be in June in Calgary. And then, of course, our flagship Geothermal Rising Conference will be next September here in Houston. So thank you for that. And then I am delighted to move forward and introduce our first speaker. Please ask your questions in the chat, and we're delighted to follow up those at the end of our presentations. And then it is my pleasure to introduce Nortey Yeboah. Nortey is currently serves as the principal engineer in Southern Company Research and Development, or R&D, where he leads efforts to identify and advance geothermal opportunities best suited for the Southern Company system. His work focuses on low temperature geothermal applications across the Southeast, including technologies such as thermal energy networks to improve energy efficiency for customers and provide peak shaving potential. Nortey also tracks emerging geothermal drilling innovations that could enable access to deep geothermal resources in the region and explores partnership opportunities for geothermal power projects in the Western U.S. through Southern Company's unregulated businesses. Since joining Southern Company in 2020, Nortey has had several engineering and program management roles supporting sustainability and innovation. He brings a strong technical foundation from prior work in the environmental consulting and construction materials R&D, as well as experience leading major environmental projects within the company. Nortey earned his BS in civil engineering and BA in geology from Bucknell University, along with his master's degree and PhD in civil engineering from Georgia Tech. His academic research focused on sustainable infrastructure development, and he continues to apply that expertise to advance Southern Company's clean energy goals. Originally born in the UK, Nortey's lived in Nigeria and Botswana before moving to the US for college. He now resides in Atlanta, enjoys hiking, disc golf, CrossFit, and cooking traditional Guyana dishes, and with his partner, Leah. So, Nortey, delighted to introduce you, and please, we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you, Carrie. Let me get my screen shared. Let me know when you can see it.
we can see it.
Perfect. So wanted to and thanks for inviting me to join this webinar. I wanted to just go over some of the things that here at Southern Company we're thinking about as it relates to geothermal, and just start off the bat introducing the company for those who might not know who we are. Southern Company is family of companies, and we support customers and businesses nationwide through electric utilities, natural gas, and then through our regulated businesses and other subsidiaries. We primarily operate in the Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi area through the electric utilities over there. With our gas utilities outside of the Southeast, we have Nicor Gas up in Illinois region, where some of our geothermal opportunities might be the most prominent right now. So just a map showing various states where through all of those previously mentioned entities, we have operations. So relatively large company, approximately 44,000 megawatts of generating capacity. And that's growing. And some of that rapid growth and the associated sort of stress or potential stress on the grid has spurred a lot of discussion within the company about ways of becoming more energy efficient and peak shaving and all of that that I think most other utilities are also looking at too, and how geothermal can play a role for Southern Company. We are, still in the phase of sort of generating our ideation around geothermal, and I work in R&D, and some of what we're charged to do is chart that path for the company and internally advise and help us think through what it could look like for Southern Company and how we make use of technologies in the power space. And so for Southern Company, as you all might imagine, our experience isn't extensive with geothermal, and primarily because the Southeast U.S., where that's our primary region, it does not have at least with current technology, easily accessible geothermal resources, and so it has not been historically a priority for Southern Company. But as we think through all of what geothermal can offer, and some of maybe the shallow geothermal opportunities, there is potential for us to really start thinking through and a little bit outside of the box, a little bit outside of what we traditionally think of as geothermal, what all the potential technologies could be available to us. Our motivations are the same as almost everybody else's, I imagine. The base load energy potential for geothermal, it's meeting our decarbonization goals, and then energy diversification. And so when I initially started looking at geothermal about 2 years ago, there were a lot of different conversations were happening, but when we think about maybe some of the more traditional aspects of geothermal in terms of power production, or accessing hot temperatures within the subsurface, a lot of thought went into the kinds of industries that might take advantage of some of that that potential within the Southeast. And we have pulp and paper, chemicals, iron and steel, and a couple of other large industry groups that use heat, and could potentially take advantage of geothermal's decarbonization potential and the high capacity factor. However, accessing that heat is not easy, and it's not cheap. And some of what I'm tracking from an R&D perspective is the technologies that would make that accessing that heat to then do some of these things a little bit easier. We have done some exploration, and a lot of the exploration that we have done has been in conjunction with carbon capture and storage projects. And so a lot of that drilling where we have been able to collect data within our region that is where we're able to collect those geothermal temperatures, bottom hole through drilling explorations have been in conjunction with carbon storage projects. But we did do a study and looked at the potential for success of potential enhanced geothermal projects potentially. And it looks, from the results of that study, Southwest and Southwest Alabama and South Mississippi region showed the highest potential within our region anyway. And there are also a number of oil and gas wells drilled in this area where we're engaged with a bunch of academia and a bunch of other research institutions looking at how we might make use of some of those existing oil and gas wells for potential geothermal projects. All of that still very early as we develop our thought process around geothermal. Where it does get a lot more interesting is when we start thinking about some of the lower temperature and shallow applications for geothermal in the realm of thermal energy networks and ground source heat pumps and how to scale that to achieve some of our energy efficiency goals, cost reductions in terms of energy costs for our customers, and then peak shaving potential if you're able to scale it appropriately. And so we're tracking, some of the projects that are ongoing out there, like what Eversource is doing up in the Boston area, and a couple of other projects. Being regulated utilities, a lot of what we do does have to be approved through a public service commission, and so we have to come with the right justifications and economics that would make some of that work. And a lot of that is tied to potential regulation or a regulatory push that might open up some of those opportunities. And in the NICOR region up in Illinois, there is some legislation that continues to be discussed that could open up some opportunities for us. So we're tracking that and have engaged with a couple of companies and started looking at some feasibility studies for geothermal networks and thermal energy networks in general, and how to scale those up to a utility-sized approach, and what the benefits could be for not just the company but for our customers as well. In particular, in Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, Southern Company has done a lot of work and is engaged in a couple of efforts that are focused specifically on our customers and how to, how to deploy technologies at a utility scale that would benefit them from a financial perspective, and ground source heat pumps, especially in new construction, is looking to be something that we might deploy and try to scale up to help reduce customer costs, but then also peak shaving potential for the region. All of this work is still in very early phases for us at Southern Company, but we sort of take the geothermal opportunity into sort of near term and then long-term view. And the more deployable technologies are these networked geothermal opportunities that a lot of other utilities, or maybe not a lot, but a number of other utilities across the country have already started doing projects in and demonstrating. And then long-term, we think that those technologies that would allow us to access the heat that we all know is there within the subsurface, projects like what Quaise Energy is doing, with advanced drilling technologies that would allow us to get down faster, cheaper, and all of that. Those are things that I am tracking and looking to implement wherever we can within our system. And in fact, we are visiting Quays next week for one of their demonstrations down in Texas. And then after that, we will be visiting with Egg Geo in Florida, looking at some of the projects that they have put in place close to their headquarters down in St. Petersburg, and just sort of learning and understanding how to effectively put in place some of these technologies within the geothermal space and include that into our portfolio. We were first time participants at the Geothermal Rising Conference, and we found that to be, one of the more helpful and target rich environments for information. So had a great experience there, and a lot of the meetings and all of that are coming up really came out of that project, out of that conference. So thank you to the Geothermal Rising team for organizing that conference, and we look forward to being annual attendance at that conference too. So those are my slides for today, and if there are any questions or thoughts from viewers from the group, love to hear.
Fantastic. Thank you. And we'll hold those questions to the end, but please put those in the chat for Nortey, and we will be delighted to revisit those here after Ryan's presentation. So it is my pleasure now to introduce Ryan Tracey. Ryan leads long-term resource planning for Sonoma Clean Power, a community choice aggregation serving Sonoma and Mendocino counties in California. Ryan started at Sonoma Clean Power in 2019 after a career as an oil and gas reservoir engineer, and has led SCP to design a supply portfolio that will mitigate 85% of its hourly carbon emissions by 2026. That's fantastic. In his role, Ryan spearheaded the creation of the Geothermal Opportunity Zone to source much of that portfolio from local geothermal resources that will provide economic opportunity and energy resiliency for the local region. SCP is in the early stages of facilitating stakeholder engagement to inform the development of geothermal projects that are compatible with the values of the local community. Fantastic, Ryan. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah. Thanks, Carrie, and really excited to be here and share our perspective on geothermal, which we continue to be really invested in this project. We've been, as Carrie said, I joined Sonoma Clean Power back in 2019. The Geothermal Opportunity Zone, which we'll talk about, has been around since 2022, and I think the case for geothermal's only gotten stronger, through time. And anyway, really excited to share our perspective and follow Nortey's kind of perspective from the other side of the country, attacking this from a different angle. So first, I wanted to provide a little background on, Carrie mentioned that Sonoma Clean Power is a community choice aggregation. I wanted to give a little background for folks on this call about what community choice aggregation is, because it's something that's unique to California, but a very important part of the California energy market. And I think I'll talk about why California itself is a very important market for geothermal. So community choice aggregations, which Sonoma Clean Power is the CCA for Sonoma and Mendocino County. These were a byproduct of legislation that passed in California after the energy market was deregulated following the energy crisis. Basically, it allows local jurisdictions to take over the responsibility of procuring wholesale power for their communities. They operate very similar to, if folks are familiar, to retail providers in like the Texas market, where you buy your generation from a different source than who's actually managing the poles and wires. They've been growing immensely in popularity in California. I think that's why they're so important. I think the first one started in 2010. Now CCAs have grown to represent 37% of load in the investor-owned utility territory. And I think importantly too, CCAs have been driving a lot of the growth in the clean energy build-out for California. California has very ambitious climate targets. And what happens when CCA customers leave the utilities portfolio, getting those clean energy targets now becomes the responsibility of the CCAs. So you can see here, there's a graph of the cumulative CCA procurement in California. Already CCAs have driven 10.5 gigawatts of renewable capacity procurement and over 7 gigawatts of battery storage procurement. Another important kind of component of this, thinking about this from the geothermal industry or IPP perspective, is CCAs have been maturing. They've been becoming increasingly credible as counterparties. A lot of CCAs now have really strong credit ratings. They've got a strong balance sheet. They're serious counterparties to deal with when you're looking at selling resources. Going forward, the perspective, the kind of CCAs are continuing to evolve and trying to figure out how to be more nimble and really be more proactive about building new clean energy resources. So we're looking at a bunch of different opportunities, including CCAs have started banding together. If people are familiar with in California, there's an organization called SCAPA, where the municipal utilities band together to be able to buy resources at scale. CCAs have started doing that. We're also starting to look at direct ownership. Sonoma Clean Power itself is looking at building its first own solar storage facility, and I think we've got greater ambitions down the road. So turning to the market for geothermal in California, we started kind of looking at geothermal as an important component of our long-term portfolio planning back in 2022. But actually following that, I think we were at that time, I think maybe a little bit ahead of the curve. We were seeing California marching towards really high decarbonization targets. Thinking about really once you get over that 80% renewable threshold, there's really an important case to be made for having clean firm capacity, and we were seeing that in our own modeling. But the state has quickly caught up, and now there's plenty of market signals, not just looking forward into the late 2030s, but even today, that really make this case strong for geothermal procurement. And a couple of things that kind of are baked into that. One is some folks on this call might have heard of, I think one thing that's been very transformational for the geothermal industry is back in 2020, 2022, that the state actually ordered load serving entities, including CCAs and investor-owned utilities, in aggregate to procure a gigawatt of firm clean resources it was originally 2028, now got pushed to 2031. But that has, really driven, the only really clean firm resource that's available in the market today at that level of scale are geothermal resources. So it's really catalyzed a lot of investment, a lot of activity for resources in California. Another big driver is looking at winter power costs. So I think going backwards, I think California, when you're looking at power forwards, you usually see power prices highest in the summertime with peak weather conditions, with summer heat waves. But there's kind of a shock wave event that happened in December 2022 where there was a natural gas infrastructure shortage, and power prices in California in December 2022 and January 2023 averaged $250 per megawatt hour around the clock. And after that, now you look at forwards for California. Now winter is always the time period where winter power costs are higher. And that, of course, is a lot harder to fill with a portfolio of solar resources. So it's really driven the case for a resource like geothermal, which actually performs best in the wintertime. The other component looking at the market in California is resource adequacy. So the way the California energy market works is load serving entities like CCAs. We need to procure energy, but we also need to have there's a capacity market. We need to have standby capacity to be able to meet peak grid conditions. And the way that RA, for short for resource adequacy, has evolved, it's shifted to now really drive the value of having a clean firm resource, because it replaces essentially having a renewable portfolio that has intermittent and storage resources, which the California has reduced the crediting for those because they're intermittent and because battery storage really just shapes load. So CCAs that have a portfolio of those types of resources then have to go to a natural gas power plant to contract for that standby capacity to be able to get credit. Whereas if they look at a clean firm resource, they're able to get the energy and they're able to get full capacity credit for that resource adequacy component. And then the other thing I mentioned is, the state has very ambitious climate goals, and you look at a lot of, energy modeling, and it does always show once you get past that 80% renewable threshold. California today is, is nearing 60%. Once you get to that 80% threshold, you really need clean, firm resources to be able to cost effectively get that last 20%. And then the other thing is there's transmission constraints. So there's, if you think about geothermal, it really kind of maximizes the energy delivered through a limited amount of transmission capacity. So all these things are kind of coupling together to really drive the case for geothermal in California when utilities are looking for what to procure. I included here on the right, so that the state every year does their own portfolio modeling to figure out what they think the optimal grid mix is, because they use that to inform transmission planning. And this is just hot off the presses. This is just a month old. This is looking at the state's latest plan. I actually picked, this is not their, to be fair, this is not their base case. They have a sensitivity case, and this is their sensitivity case, which I think is actually the most realistic. Their sensitivity case is looking at what happens if offshore wind doesn't occur in California, which currently is a big part of the energy mix, and also what happens if wind is less available due to wind moratoriums and also just getting it from out of state. And you can see that the scale of expected geothermal capacity growth in California is pretty astounding, which shows between conventional and EGS, over 10 gigawatts of market demand by the time we hit 2045. And this is with what I think are fairly fair, if not even a little bit conservative cost estimates. So I put these down below just to give you a sense of, these are the types of pricing the state is assuming when trying to figure out this optimal mix. So it's assuming conventional geothermal costs $143 per megawatt hour. I chose 2035 as a year, and EGS is 182 per megawatt hour. If you look at a lot of the momentum that's happening in the geothermal industry, I'm very bullish on being able to drive costs far below those, which only increases the case for the geothermal build out. One thing that Sonoma Clean Power is very focused on is trying to drive opportunities for development in the state of California. We've got plenty of hot rock in California. We're already currently the largest producing geothermal state. And I think one thing we've been a little bit frustrated with is to get to that gigawatt procurement order, we're seeing most of the projects that are able to get online by that 2031 date are happening out of state. So if you look at some of the activity, let's kind of talk about some of the activities that are happening. So the largest contributor to meeting that MTR is the acronym for the PUC procurement order. To meeting that procurement order is actually Fervo's Cape Station project in Utah. So you might have seen they've signed a PPA with SCE for 320 megawatts. There's a bunch of different CCAs that are also off-takers at Cape Station. So that project's happening in Utah. And meanwhile, I think some of the projects that were expected to contribute a lot to California's near-term geothermal demands have had some road bumps. So the biggest one being Berkshire had a portfolio of large geothermal projects in the Salton Sea, and it was just announced earlier this year that those were going to be suspended. And meanwhile, a lot of the other contracts that are fulfilling the near-term procurement are happening in Nevada, and there's some in the Imperial Valley. But what we're finding is, I think these out-of-state projects are doing a great job of getting us to that gigawatt, but the scalability beyond that becomes difficult because you fill up the transmission lines that exist to California. So you're then faced with, okay, do you look at opportunities to develop in state, which is Sonoma Clean Power's view of let's try to figure that out, or do you have to make some big investments in transmission capacity to these other states? So our approach to addressing the problem of trying to get more industry interest and development in California, and specifically in our region, is this project called the Geothermal Opportunity Zone. So this is the project I alluded to earlier that we started in 2022. The idea of the GeoZone is for a utility to play a role, especially a public utility with community relationships, to provide a role in risking early development activities. And the analogy we like to use is it lays out the welcome mat for industry. So the way we've approached this, I think the first thing we did is we actually got Sonoma County and Mendocino County, the board of supervisors of both those counties, to pass resolutions themselves joining the GeoZone and saying, hey, we're very interested in industry exploring opportunities. And I think that's really set a strong foundation. I think when we've talked to, we've talked with our industry partners and brought them in, they've been very, very excited and pleased with the amount of support from the elected officials, which is a great starting point. We've built upon that with Sonoma Clean Power being the public power provider. We have a lot of relationships with community groups, with other local governments like the cities, tribal entities. We've been starting to play the role of introducing the geothermal industry and these new companies and new partners to our community. So it's a big part of what the GeoZone entails. The other thing is a utility who has an appetite for geothermal, we can provide future offtake commitments. We basically tell the industry that we have a fixed appetite for geothermal going forward, and instead of we're going to be a lot more forward thinking than the traditional model where we might not sign a PPA until you have an interconnect and you have a permit and all that. We'll commit earlier than that, and we'll also pay more for first initial developments so we understand those costs more. And then the other part of this is that we promise to go to the legislature, fight on the regulatory front to try to get the types of things that industry needs to make projects more viable. I did want to talk too a little bit more about some other kind of novel commercial strategies, because I think what we've found is that geothermal is different than solar and storage. The traditional PPA model doesn't necessarily work because it has a lot of upfront project risk. The project timelines can be a lot longer. So a couple of different types of commercial approaches to managing that risk I want to go through, and these are things that we've either done or conceptually explored with industry. So the first one is a portfolio of PPA, and this is something that Sonoma Clean Power currently has through its joint procurement entity with ORMAT. And the idea of a portfolio PPA is that instead of signing a PPA for a specific project, you sign a PPA for a range of capacity and allow the developer to fill that capacity with their selection of projects. And once the projects are suitably mature, they put them in the PPA. And the reason that the portfolio PPA works really well is, it allows a developer that has maybe a large exploration portfolio and is pretty confident that through that portfolio, they're going to be able to deliver capacity, but aren't sure which projects necessarily are going to encounter either exploration risk or permitting risk. It lets them commercialize that sooner. And I think that's been very effective with the effective way of managing that. Of course, the prerequisite for that is you have to have a portfolio of resources that is really well suited to ORMAT, and it might be less suited to industry players who have a limited number of projects. The other thing I already alluded to is joint procurement. So the idea of multiple off-takers joining together to procure resources. That helps risk because it diversifies, it makes the off-takers be able to bear more risk on if a project falls short because they have a smaller piece. So it also allows us to procure more at scale. So if we want to do like a larger portfolio, that joint procurement is really helpful. Another thing we've explored are partnership MOUs. So similar to the GeoZone, we've also explored other types of early types of agreements with industry where we're not necessarily ready for a PPA, but we're ready to help understand the commerciality and the types of resources we need and the way to get it to our customers, and it like enables kind of early communication between counterparties and helps projects move along. Another one, this one that we've only more conceptually explored, is looking at scaling PPA pricing with capacity. So a lot of projects, you might not be sure if you are going to get 10 megawatts or 30 megawatts at kind of an early stage. You have the exploration risk and the risk of how a test goes. And I think from the utilities perspective, we're interested in helping manage risk for those projects. And our appetite obviously scales with lower pricing. So how this would be constructed is, at 10 megawatts, we'd be paying a higher PPA price, which would be sufficient for the project to still be economic. But if you get to 30 megawatts, then we have a lower PPA price, which you can bear because you're amortizing the costs over a much higher capacity. And the utility has more appetite because it's a lower price. So it's a way to address that situation. And we've also looked at letters of intent to help kind of early players raise funding. And then we've also started exploring, I mentioned CCAs are interested in direct ownership, looking at build transfer agreements. So before closing here, I kind of want to talk about what's next for Sonoma Clean Power. So we've successfully enacted 2 different bills over the last 2 legislative sessions to address industry barriers to deployment in California. We've got a lot of exciting opportunities going to 2026. So we're looking at trying to de-risk exploration permitting. We're looking at trying to find funding for early project development specific to industry opportunities to bring geothermal to California. We're looking at expanding our GeoZone, looking for new industry partners. We're also working with our joint procurement entity to look at statewide partnerships. We're focusing also on resource characterization. We just got a state grant to partner with NREL on trying to use high resolution thermal modeling, trying to look at actually very high resolution also surface data to try to find where are places that you could site geothermal that don't have sensitive ecological conditions, but also intersect with high geothermal opportunities. I talked about trying to find some more state funding for geothermal. We're trying to figure out how to increase leasing activity in California. They had the first lease sale, the BLM had the first lease sale in California, and the first time I think it was over a decade. But it's pretty limited. Trying to figure out how to jumpstart that. And then we're also spending a lot of time trying to get transmission planned and built to geothermal areas because sometimes they're remote, and it's important that when you're going through the early project development that you're also not looking at, okay, is there a risk I'm not going to have interconnect or I'm not going to get the transmission available. But with that, yeah, I think that's a wrap.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ryan. So I'll ask Nortey to join us again, and I'll get us kicked off. I do ask if you can put your questions in the Q&A. I see several kind of queuing up, so really appreciate those that have already asked a question. But I'm going to get us started off just following up, Ryan, of your novel commercial models that you spoke to, that you're using to help encourage development, geothermal development. Is there something that's really stood out as having significant promise? I know a couple of those I'm familiar with from oil and gas and some other industries, but is there something that with your geothermal developers has really stood out?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, I'm personally most excited about the partnership agreements we've done for the geothermal opportunity zone. So these are our agreements that, have early commercial commitments from Sonoma Clean Power, and then community engagement support, and then, in return for investment in the area. But those are still kind of early days. I think that the concept that has had the most actual success in driving project development is the portfolio PPA. I think that allowed California Community Power, the joint procurement entity, to be actually the first contract announced after the procurement order, and still one of the largest, and allowed that to happen early and move forward and de-risk that. So
fantastic. Yeah. And hopefully that helps de-risk some of those projects for further investment, right? As they're looking to do and develop more. So I think that's a fantastic evolution for the market. Thank you. And so I think this one's a little more Nortey. I'm going to go back to some of the questions that have come in from our audience. And this one says, there was just an exciting headline about Illinois passing a bill to fund thermal energy network pilot projects. Are there any initiatives in the southern states to fund thermal energy networks in Georgia, Florida, or Mississippi? And if not, is there an appetite for that? Is that some of your community engagement, Nortey?
Absolutely. So yeah, we're tracking what's happening up in Illinois, and we've submitted an RFI and gotten a lot of responses back for that NICOR region. In the Southeast, there's a challenge there because there isn't, at least from a legislation standpoint, we're not seeing anything sort of moving in that area. But that is not preventing us as a Southern company and the R&D group to think through what could the potential be, looking at what some of the other folks have done, right? And so how we engage with our regulators and our legislators is sort of, we're in that phase of sort of making that business case and presenting them with that information. And a lot of what I do outside of the day-to-day R&D work here is engaging with folks like that to talk about potential technologies and things like that, and then how they can help us through regulation and legislation, implement some of that. And so, very nascent for Southern Company, especially in our traditional region, because of all the challenges, firstly and foremost, that geothermal resource not being as prominent as it is out west. But there are a lot of technologies and a lot of ways that we can make use of the subsurface. And so, we're engaged on all fronts to try and, educate both internally within Southern Company and then externally as well.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you, Norte. And we really appreciate, again, you not being in a traditional hydrothermal area, taking the lead in the Southeast US with geothermal. That's fantastic. So just kind of following up on that question, we have one that's geared a little bit more towards for Ryan. So it says from our audience, is SCP interested in direct use geothermal applications like district heating or district industrial use, or focus primarily on power production?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Yeah, no, I think the direct use applications are always very attractive because you lose the whole, efficiency hit with power production. And one of our GeoZone partners is Ever, who, for those who are not familiar, they're currently doing a project in Garrett Street, Germany, that has a direct heat component and a power component. And there's been a lot of thought towards, thinking about like, those first deployments that will happen in the GeoZone with novel technologies having some direct use kind of application, because it helps de-risk those kind of first deployments, and they're more highly economic. I think we do struggle a little bit because we're Sonoma County. We've got a couple cities, but we're fairly rural. We don't have we don't have very many clear high density applications for like a district type system, and we also don't have a whole lot of industrial activity, but it's definitely on our radar. Yeah, appreciate the question.
All right, fantastic. Thank you. So I have another question from the audience. It says, as far as landowner and local community support, what footprint does a utility scale geothermal project have? And I'll just add to that, is that something that as a utility you're particularly concerned about? How does that fit into your evaluation of partners and projects?
Yeah, I can take that. So I think, and this is very conceptual level, but I think when we're looking at like a 100 megawatt type scale, project, I think we're usually looking at about 40 acres of land disturbance on the surface. Now that involves, usually a well pad with, if you're thinking about EGS or closed loop, with a lot of directional drilling that is going and harvesting heat from the subsurface, in the area that's probably 500 acres, from that 40-acre land disturbance, harvesting heat from a much larger area. So I think actually one of the challenges is in a lot of states, including California, the mineral rights are different than the surface rights. They're severed. And that actually is especially a problem in our territory, because back in the 1960s, when the geysers was started, it was the Wild West. There's prospectors all over the place. And people signed away their mineral rights, and they don't remember that they did that. So I think part of the issue is, I think from the community support, obviously, community engagement, they're very worried about what does the surface footprint look like. And I think communicating about how much smaller it is and how dense like the power production is per acre versus other technologies is super important. And 40 acres is not huge, but it's still noticeable. So it's been, we've had a lot of conversations with our community about that. But actually the other challenge is too trying to find subsurface mineral rights that people still have, or that you can kind of find continuous to be able to secure to enable project development.
Fantastic. Thank you. So then I'm going to do one follow-up, and this will probably apply to both of you, Nortley, if you're interested as well. And so when you're speaking to that direct community engagement with both of you have spoken to, what does that look like? I know that's a challenge many developers are working on, and something that the geothermal space continues to, as a fairly developing market in many areas of the country. What does that really look like for you, and how are you, kind of spearheading that education and bringing the community in?
Well, I mean, for us in Georgia and Alabama, we do a lot in terms of just understanding what are the pain points for our customers, and a lot of modeling is happening to think through what we can do as a utility to help relieve some of that. Community meetings, we have folks that are dedicated, that is their role What I do is educate the folks who are going out there, right? And so being so early in our development of the geothermal sort of thought process, a lot of that still hasn't really made it out to maybe some of those engagement opportunities. But we are starting to model, we are starting to engage with academia, and hopefully from that, so that sort of grows and develops into more sort of larger scale efforts where we're going out there to really show what the potential could be. And so my goal is to get a demonstration or some sort of a pilot operational, and then using that pilot to then information blast about what the potential could be. I don't know how long that's going to take for us, but I am I'm super excited about that piece and really trying to engage, because these direct use or lower temperature or shallower geothermal opportunities really lend themselves towards community cost efficiency, energy efficiency, and we already have programs in place that are not necessarily geothermal focused, but adding that into the mix is something that I'm super excited about, and have already had some initial conversations with our leadership about how we're going to do that and how we're going to roll that out. So not a whole lot happening necessarily specifically around geothermal and community engagement just yet, but maybe if you invite me back this time next year, I'll have more to share.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Oh,
Ryan, do you have something
yeah,
to add to that?
sure. Yeah, I'll share a couple examples of how we kind of got into community engagement. So I think one of our main focuses in thinking about engaging the community, looking at the types of technologies that we expect will be deployed in the GeoZone. One of those is enhanced geothermal systems, which involves hydraulic fracturing. So I think one of the big focuses for us is we live in progressive and blue Sonoma County, where hydraulic fracturing is something that is thought about with a lot of skepticism. So we've really tried to focus on our education efforts on explaining why that is different than oil and gas. We've hosted town halls in a couple of different cities in Sonoma County, where we've specifically targeted bringing a lot of community activists, people who we expect to be skeptics. We brought the Department of Energy in to add credibility, to be able to explain why these things are important. So that's been one big focus. I think one of the other ones, is we've tried to create some more visibility that our current energy system that supplies Sonoma County is dependent on facilities that people might not want elsewhere in the state. So our CEO actually penned an op-ed in our local newspaper a year or two ago called "Our Dirty Little Secret," and what he was laying out is the case that we've got natural gas power plants that are running in impoverished communities in Southern California, to be able to keep our lights on. And Sonoma County has the benefit of we don't have any fossil fuel power plants that we have to live with, but we're really leaning on these other communities to be able to keep our lights on. And us being able to support geothermal development, needing to bring in new technologies and test them here, helps us do our part to help provide support, not only meeting the climate targets of the state, but also help some of these other communities. And I think that message has worked with a lot of folks in our neck of the woods. Of course, there's always going to be I think NIMBYs, people who are living next to geothermal development are going to be naturally opposed. But I think we've started building a really strong foundation of understanding and enthusiasm. But yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ryan. So following up on that question with both of you, we talked about the geothermal everywhere and a lot of the different opportunities with thermal energy networks, back to power, and all of the different things that are continuing to grow in the industry. So I know we've talked to, and the industry is aware of, a number of grid limitations, right? There's infrastructure limitations with transmission and things like that. So is that a concern for you when you're looking at these projects, and how does that fit into your evaluation for a geothermal development?
Yeah, I can start. So yes, this is one of the huge constraints when we think about geothermal deployment. I kind of think of a couple of different sectors. There's the transmission Transmission availability is an early project risk. There's the exploration risk. There's the permitting risk. So talking about the transmission risk, specifically in our region, we are lucky that the geysers back in the 1960s, scaling up through the early 1990s, was built to be a 2 gigawatt facility. So they put all the transmission infrastructure in place for 2 gigawatts of capacity. The geysers right now only makes 800 megawatts. So just on just kind of at a high level, there is spare transmission capacity. But we've actually run into a lot of issues with bottlenecks further down the system because what I mentioned, that resource adequacy concept, the capacity concept. So California will only allow projects to count for resource adequacy if it's proven during peak grid conditions that they can actually help the grid weather those summer grid conditions. And what that means for a geothermal project in our region is it has to be able to flow power to southern LA when there's a statewide heat wave, which means that it has to go through transmission bottlenecks in the Central Valley. So it's really we've actually since getting in the geothermal opportunity zone, we've actually gotten a lot more adept at navigating transmission planning, understanding infrastructural limitations. We've hired unhoused transmission expertise, which has helped actually us get a better view of our overall portfolio. But it's a big limitation, and I think the problem is, again, with compared it to solar storage projects, which are very flexible. They can move around to where they can plug into where there is spare capacity in the grid. You don't have that flexibility, at least today, with geothermal projects. I know long term, hopefully with quays and the deep EGS and all these other types of technologies, you'd be able to do it anywhere, but we're not there yet. It's still, you want to do it in the hotter areas first, which requires you to be very proactive about planning transmission capacity. So yeah, something we think about every day.
Okay, fantastic. So just following up on a couple of things, I had another question from the audience, and would love to hear from either of you on this. Could geothermal energy be used to power data centers?
My honest answer is I don't know. I'm sure it could. Where data centers have come into the conversation from some of the work we're doing on the R&D side here in the Southeast, because I'm sure is the same with a lot of utility spaces across the country. Bunch of data centers coming into Georgia, Alabama, and for the resource that we have, geothermal, and the types of technologies we think are deployable in the short term here in the Southeast. We've thought about how the cooling needs for data centers could be met with some of these shallow geothermal technologies. And there are a couple of companies thinking through, how do you store cold energy in the subsurface and then retrieve it when you need it? And so that's the level to which we've engaged as it relates to data centers. And there are others in R&D who are more sort of focused on energy storage and things like that they're engaging in those conversations and that kind of technology development. So that's where it sits for us at Southern Company.
Yeah, I don't think I have a whole lot to add to that. I think, in general, I think geothermal is a great resource like profile when you're looking at trying to feed a portfolio that includes data centers. So, certainly connecting geothermal to the same grid that is serving data center load, I think has a lot of benefits. Now, whether there's an intersection of, some of the conditions that make data center siting beneficial, and where a geothermal project is, we haven't seen necessarily a lot of that. Like, I think specifically in our region, one of the big issues is water scarcity. We don't, Sonoma County we've got a lot of water demand already from the wine industry, from ag, and we've got a limited water supply, increasing drought severity. So it's not the best place for data centers that are looking for a lot of water for cooling. So in that specific instance, there's not necessarily a good intersection of co-location. But I think having them both on the same grid, there's a lot of reasons that geothermal can help.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ryan. So we're getting close to time. And as a final question for each of you, just looking out into the ecosphere, I know you've both spent a lot of time with the geothermal market, or at least thank you for joining us at GRC for the first time. in Reno a few weeks ago. What do you see as the most promising next step for the geothermal market? Like, what have you seen out there that just really gets you excited about the future of geothermal?
It's an easy one for me. I mean, and this is a super long shot, super down the line, but that potential for geothermal anywhere is really that's really the spark that needs to continue sort of growing for it to become a reality in the Southeast, right? And so the Quaise Energies of the world who are helping advance the possibility of accessing deeper temperatures, that's where I think the real revolution will happen for regions like ours. And it's why we're heading out there to down to Texas to look at their demonstration next week, actually.
Fantastic, Ryan. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think in a kind of very similar lens, I think we're very interested in projects kind of approaching the modularity concept. The idea of like what Fervo is doing in Cape Station of being able to learn and apply lessons and be able to do the same thing over and over and over again and get better and better and better about it. So I think that both the EGS and the closed loop concept of being able to get away from some of the challenges with unique hydrothermal constraints and having to custom design a project and having specific risk for that specific project. I think getting over that, I think is something that we're really excited about. I think it also kind of a corollary is where I mentioned that water scarcity is a big issue in our region. The geysers right now, the reason that they're able to produce and sustain production at what they're currently at is because they put in a really cool project back in the early 2000s to take all the wastewater from Sonoma County and take it to the geysers to be able to recharge that reservoir. But the problem is there's not a whole lot more wastewater to go around, so that the scalability of that is limited unless we bring in new technologies that are water neutral. So I think the idea of closed loop, the idea of if we're able to do EGS in very deep basement rock and prove that there's very low water loss, specific to our region, really increases the scalability factor. So yeah.
All right, fantastic. Well, I want to thank both of you, Nortey from Southern Company and Ryan from Sonoma Clean Power, and for joining us today for this Full Steam Ahead webinar. I think we've learned a lot about utilities. I know there's a lot of questions and how we connect as a geothermal market with the utilities and work together. So appreciate you taking some time out of your day to help us, and really appreciate the efforts that both of you and your companies are doing in that arena. We appreciate you being part of the geothermal family. All right. I hope everybody has a good afternoon, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.